Good morning and welcome. I'm Peter Pham. For those of you who don't know me, I have the honor of being the director of the Michael S. Ansari Africa Center here at the Atlantic Council. And on behalf of our chairman, Senator Chuck Hagel, and our president, Fred Kemp, it's my pleasure to welcome you this morning to both to this discussion on managing societal fault lines in 21st century Africa and to the American launch of the volume that you have in front of you on the fault line. Before introducing our moderator, permit me to say a word about the Council's Africa Center for the benefit of those who are new to us today. The Michael S. Ansari Africa Center was established in September 2009 with a mission to help transform U.S. and European policy approaches to Africa by emphasizing the building of strong geopolitical partnerships with African states and strengthening economic growth and prosperity on the continent. The center seeks to engage and inform both policymakers and the general public of the strategic importance of Africa, both globally and for American and European interests in particular, through programs and publications, as well as a robust media presence. Within the context of the Atlantic Council's work to promote constructive U.S. leadership and engagement in international affairs based on the central role of the Atlantic community in meeting international challenges, the Center supports and collaborates with public and private sectors in forging practical solutions to the challenges and opportunities in Africa. One of our most valued partners is the Brenthurst Foundation, represented here by its director, Greg Mills. The Brenthurst Foundation has the mandate to encourage key decision makers and experts to share experiences and insights in private meetings and seminars, to deliver relevant practical policy advice to governments, and to generate new thinking and thought leadership to address Africa's development challenges. A mandate which very much mirrors our own, so we're delighted once again to partner up with the Brenthurst Foundation and to deliver this program to you today. We're also very pleased, and I'm going to wrap up now and turn the floor over to have Ambassador Mary Yates to moderate today's discussion. Ambassador Yates needs no introduction, but just a few highlights of her distinguished career in the Foreign Service, including ambassadorships to Ghana and Burundi, foreign policy advisor to the U.S. European Command, the first deputy to the Commander for Civil Military Affairs at the U.S. Africa Command, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Africa at the National Security Council, and most recent, possibly one of the most challenging but I think exciting assignments in her career, wrapping up as Charge d'Affaires of the U.S. Embassy in the Republic of Sudan in the north. So we're very grateful that she's joined us here today and we're moderating today's discussion. So without further ado, Ambassador Mary Yates.
Thank you, Peter. Does my mic work? Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everyone. And I would like to thank the Atlantic Council for inviting me to moderate this. This is a most distinguished group of authors, and it's also a very distinguished audience, so I'm humbled. Special thanks as well to the Brenthurst Foundation, I think, for conceiving this project, commissioning these case studies, and what I've read, I just want to read more. I know these are 13 of the 24 cases. I want to know if I can read the other cases that didn't make it to print, because I think you learn from each case. And I predict that there will be a widespread readership for this volume. I think it will appeal to academics, to policymakers, practitioners, and I hope NGOs, especially those that work in democracy and governance. You'll soon hear from the authors directly, but Peter asked if I could make a couple of introductory comments and connect it to some of my own African experiences. But I turn to you in the introduction. The first chapter is Managing Fault Lines in the 21st Century. The key word for that for me is managing, and in some of the countries I've been in, managing is not what it was. You tried to. And each of the authors were asked to look at these four issues in their subject country: governance and the spark of economic grievance, the democratic context, globalization and external intervention, and then the fourth, the need for flexibility of response. I may have some questions on that last one later. The pieces vary a good bit, but they certainly stay with this template in their approach. And the book, as Peter indicated, includes nations from throughout the globe, but our focus today is going to be on Africa. We certainly have innumerable fault lines and conflicts in Africa, and some of them are the most dramatic, so I think it's important we focus on that. And after my 31-year diplomatic career, with almost 15 in Africa, I learned a lot from reading this book. Many times I have pondered in my time in Africa why nation building works in some countries and absolutely fails so blatantly in others. I certainly asked this repeatedly in my 4 years in the Congo, which was Zaire at the time. And I came to many of the same conclusions that Peter Engelbert did, who called Congo a crime of a country. I thought all the time I lived there, don't the people of the Congo deserve better? But Engelbert writes about in great detail the enormous regional differences, the corrupt governance, the problems of access to land, even access to citizenship, which I remember from following the national conference back in 1991. But I think that it is easy to conclude, as scholars off and on have over the years with the Congo, why not just separate it? I remember when we were there, why not Mbuji-Mayi, why not Lubumbashi, why don't they break apart and make them separate countries? I think one of the questions we have to ask, and the conclusion writes about the thorny issue of boundaries, that certainly South Sudan secession has opened that Pandora's box. But I think 2 points that Engelbert made from the Congo that could apply more widely are that it is not for outsiders to decide, but the Congolese, what they're going to do about resolving some of the fault lines in their society. And the second point, when he talks about the national government that I think some would question in the Congo, is a national government. Should it be, reformed, diluted, divested down to the local level? And I think that merits looking at with some of these other cases. A more positive example relating to my history, ironically, is Burundi, and I think those ethnic fault lines, those societal fault lines are pretty clear. They were historic and clear, and they caused massive violence. How then, in the case of Burundi, did a peace process, brick by brick, build a way out of that conflict? Is it fragile? Yes. And I look to the leaders of Nyerere and Mandela, who their outstanding leadership, as well as the international community, and I'm not sure I totally agree with the book's view of the international community, but we'll get to that. But the idea that with the nursemaids of the international community, the Burundian peace process resolved a conflict that had festered for a decade. And I said, to me, it is an utter amazement that the Burundian soldiers are now peacekeepers in Somalia. Change can come. And I said, wouldn't it be amazing someday if Sudan's SAF were peacekeepers in the Maghreb or in sub-Saharan Africa? It is not beyond imagining, at least, I think, even though Peter may check me here. Final comment on Sudan. Anne Rudder's chapter, and I don't know her, but this is a brilliant chapter. Her line that that the two Sudans offer an extreme fault line management option, and I concur with that 100%. She laments that Sudan, historically from independence, has been unable to forge an overarching narrative of the Sudan nationhood, and I agree. Why is that? Why is peace so elusive? And actually, she questions, almost criticizes, that what is happening now of trying to resolve the international border area, seen as a key issue, is that really the way to ameliorate the situation, or will it possibly just exacerbate it more? Anyway, I think her chapter brilliantly encapsulates the history of divided Sudan. And I also pointed out that she applauds the CPA, and I think we would see that as a management tool of fault lines, but then shows that it too has come up short. I mean, is Sudan a country that is just not manageable? And my final comment will be from my time as, and I see my friend, the former Spanish ambassador from Khartoum, who's just arrived here, but I thought I knew something about Sudan before I went there. But when you talk about the layers and layers of societal fault lines, it's not just north-south. This is within the NCP, within the SAF. And I found a nation unable to deal with the North, the Red Sea state, the Bedouins, you know, the fault lines within their country that have nothing to do with the North-South debate. Anyway, I've taken more than my 5 minutes, Peter, and I know you want to hear from the authors, but thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you also for leading off this book launch. I'd like to also thank Dr. Pham and the Atlantic Council for being our kind hosts, as well as Peter for contributing a chapter. Our third co-editor, Terry McNamee, is in Johannesburg right now, keeping the home fires burning, and but I know he's here in spirit. We were motivated to begin this project in part because of a simple but I think important observation. Sometime around the middle of last century, something profound happened in human history, in the history of international relations, which is that more people started to be killed by their own governments than by other governments. And that the threat of physical safety evolved over the latter part of the 20th century to be much more a threat of domestic turmoil, civil war, uprising like, than international war. And even though the history of international relations is structured around interstate war, we don't see that much of that today. But what we see instead is significant at times violence within states. When states erupt in violence, and we have now an enormous amount of statistical evidence of this from the World Bank and others, not only is the immediate violence calamitous for the populations involved, but the setbacks in terms of health, education alike are profound and can often set a country back a generation in just a few years of violence. So the stakes at looking at fault lines, especially domestic fault lines, we thought was very profound. This is, I think, a particularly good moment to look at this issue because we have now a long history, not only how some countries in Western Europe and East Asia have seemingly overcome their fault lines, but also significant efforts, as the ambassador said, over many years by the international community to try to manage or solve, and there's been some ambiguity in that, divisions within states. To some extent, there's nothing very surprising in terms of what's happening within divided countries right now, because it takes a long time, as the ambassador said, to do nation building, which is inherently hard because people are loath to give up the right to defend themselves to some distant capital unless they are very secure that distant capital will take care of them. That's the fundamental nature of nation building. In Western Europe, this happened over centuries. France, as you know, was divided for centuries, and as late as the mid-19th century, a very significant number of people were not speaking French. But that state managed to overcome its societal divisions, as many others have had, over a process of time. What's changed in our era is first much greater knowledge of what's happening around the world, much greater impatience to see these conflicts resolved, and an unwillingness to just say, time will take care of it. And finally, an increase in the technology of killing, probably, so that people can die in much larger numbers much quicker. As a result, in World War I, we saw that about 95% of the mortality was amongst combatants, that is soldiers in uniform fighting each other. Today, in the conflicts that still exist in Africa, in Eastern Congo, in Somalia and elsewhere, probably 95% or more of the mortality is concentrated among civilians. And those are the people who suffer the most. When looking at this kind of project, of course, we were interested in tapping experts who knew a great deal about the cases, because we wanted rich, detailed cases where the authors understood the flow of time and had been on the ground. Fortunate to have three of our co-authors here, Peter, Joel, and Peter Lewis, who have written profound chapters on their areas of study. We commissioned 24 cases. As is inevitable in a project like this, some of our co-authors dropped out over time, and space did not allow for every single chapter, but we learned much from them over the course of 3 conferences. And it should be noted that we commissioned studies of both countries that had ostentatiously failed to manage their fault lines in the recent past and had therefore suffered significant violence, but also cases where there had been considerable success. To take only one example, Canada, in quite cleverly and adroitly and intentionally managing their fault lines. And we tried in both the introduction and the conclusion to draw from all of those lessons. The eruption of fault lines, ethnic, class, race, regional divisions, is very difficult to predict. And it's notable that some of the countries that have been celebrated at various moments for successfully managing their fault lines, Lebanon, Somalia, Yugoslavia, Sri Lanka, at various moments, all subsequently devolved into significant violence. It's also the case, that as people have noted in the political science literature, that the actual probability of large-scale violence erupting is relatively low. That is, considering the number of fault lines out there, contrary to the picture of the world in flames, it's actually relatively rare that you get mass violence. And that suggests that predicting when outbreaks are going to occur is very difficult. And one of the themes of many of our case studies, in fact, is that when you are on the ground, as the ambassador said, peeling away the onion, these conflicts are very complicated, and the standard description, north, south, white, black, Catholic, Protestant, or ethnic, turns out to be much more complicated. And I think our authors have done a tremendous job in peeling away that onion to give everyone an idea of not only the kernel of the conflict, but the layers that surround it. As the ambassador said, we were interested in 3 main themes, and I won't repeat what she said, but we did note that in a great number of the case studies, economic grievance was at the heart of fault line violence. In particular, we noted that when a constituency of losers, our term, was formed, that is a group that felt, often with very good reason, in fact, there was almost always an empirical basis for their grievance, that they had been discriminated against over a long period of time in the allocation of goods, whether it be land, houses, water, or whatever. That was usually the necessary precursor for violence. However, economic grievance was seldom enunciated as the fundamental narrative of the conflict. And that's where I think the complexity begins to develop. Nor was it the case that these people were just fighting over an incremental improvement in their income. They have some greater narrative that their group, ethnic, racial, regional, religious, whatever, had been done in. But if you look at the core of the conflict, economic grievance was there. And we therefore put a very high stress on the governance agenda that, of course, much of the international community has adopted in rhetoric, if not in fact, because it turns out that rather than the specific management of fault lines, management of economic governance is probably the best long-term solution to preventing fault lines from deteriorating into violence and also for solving those issues. It's not that people were just fighting over a slice of the pie, but a misallocation of the pie slices was a critical part of a process that then began to take into account characteristics of racial, ethnic, and other types of division. We also know that the democratic context that much of this fault line violence occurs in, and this is a big change from previous decades. Given that most countries across the world hold elections, it is the case that fault line violence now occurs in at least nominally democratic settings in many places. That's a very significant change from previous decades where fault line violence was almost always in authoritarian or no party or one party rule states. That presents both opportunities and challenges, which my co-authors will talk about. The opportunity, of course, is that the structures of democracy, most notably elections, but also other democratic structures, including, as Joel Barkan has written about at great length, federalism, provide new opportunities to, if not solve, manage fault line violence. On the other hand, the democratic context also provides new dynamics and sometimes new impetus for violence. In particular, elections, with their us against them dynamic, will often promote, at least in the short term, violence, at least until people are convinced that their democracies are institutionalized. Overall, our authors conclude that elections by themselves will not be a tool in the main to solve fault line divisions. However, they may be part of a process that, if you look at it much deeper, including how people vote, proportional representation, or other systems, federalism and the like, that there are a set of tools that democracy provides to countries which, if used properly, may be able to be part of the solution of managing these divisions. But that will take time. And finally, we note, as the ambassador said, that all of these divisions now occur in the context of globalization. And I won't go on much on this point other than to say this is a reality, and that what our authors found in particular, beyond the general observations about how the global economy, global information system, global political developments affect countries, is that too many Western observers in particular believe that globalization is implicitly a one-way street, which is we are affecting them much more. We know much more about them. But as several of our authors noted, it also means that they, if you like, I'll stay in the American prism here, know much more about us and are able to manipulate us in our politics much more dramatically than before. They understand our political systems. They understand the levers of public opinion. They may not always be successful in pushing them, but sometimes they are. And that we are much more open to manipulation than was previously the case because of globalization. And we have to get past the naivete that still surrounds some of the discussions about globalization. People have to get over the fact that Facebook is everywhere. It should not be a surprise that the Iranians or anyone else are using Facebook or mobile cell phones. These technologies are embedded in most parts of the world now, as cell phones are in many places more sophisticated use than in the United States. And second, as the ambassador noted, we believe, or we write in the conclusion, that we have to have much more flexibility about certain practices than in the past, most notably flexibility towards the management of boundaries. Pre-1945, boundary change was one way which countries used to solve, resolve, or otherwise address countries which in and of themselves seemed incompetent or incapable of moving forward. Implicitly, we got rid of that entire form of management with a very few exceptions, such as South Sudan, without ever saying why. We believe that we could now create states which would last forever. And I think that assumption has to be questioned again, not only in Africa, but in other parts of the world. And indeed, in other parts of the world, whether it be former Yugoslavia, the Middle East, and like, moving boundaries as part of the solution to fault line violence is accepted much more readily than within the continent itself. So this has been a tremendously exciting project. I'm grateful for my co-authors and the Brenthurst Foundation for being able to participate. I'm delighted to hand it over to my colleagues now.
I was just going to say, Joel, we're going to do 3 of the case studies, but with Joel's, you get 3 countries in one, with Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. So we're off to a great start.
Okay, I didn't realize it was going to be first, but that's fine. First, I want to thank you all for coming, and also for the Atlantic Council for hosting the event, and particularly the Brenthurst Foundation. Most of us who participated in the 3 conferences were Africanists, but not all, and so for those of us who look at conflict from an African perspective, it was nice to have these other cases, and we were not all academics. There was quite a good representation of individuals who had not only public policy people, but, for example, military commander in Northern Ireland. So it was very refreshing. I'm going to give you a political science take on ethnic conflict in three East African countries, and then add two others for purposes of comparisons, and then speak to the public policy issue. So it's going to be one part geek on the one hand and one part policy on the other. As the editors note in their introduction, quoting Dan Posner among others, there are fault lines in every society, and there are particularly ethnic fault lines in many societies. And ethnicity by itself does not lead to conflict, particularly deadly conflict, just like being poor does not lead to revolution. Otherwise, the world would have been in flames long ago. So what I do is I look at the three East African countries, plus Rwanda and Nigeria in passing, in a comparative perspective, and try to present a formula, which I think holds up generally, to explain why and where ethnic conflict occurs, particularly at a deadly level, and what to do about it. So the first is ethnicity itself. African societies, as we know, are multi-ethnic. There's nothing particularly new there. But it's surprising to me that until very recently, very few people had looked at the configuration of ethnicity as one moves from one country to the next. And I suggest a rather simple dimension here, and that is the degree of ethnic fractionalization. That is to say, in societies where you have a small number of large ethnic groups, you're much more likely to have conflict than where you have a large number of small ethnic groups. And the three East African countries give you a very nice range of cases over that generalization. Tanzania, a society with over 120 ethnic groups, no one of them larger than 10% of the population, and that group very remote from the capital city. Ethnicity has never been the basis of politics in Tanzania. Well, there are a few exceptions, but that's getting into the weeds. By and large, it hasn't been the basis of politics nor of conflict. Now, in contrast, next door, you're all familiar with the situation in Kenya and the historical situation in Uganda, which hasn't manifested itself recently, but was very troublesome back in the 1960s and essentially was kept under the lid by repressive regimes in the 1970s and the 1980s, and maybe emerging again. In those two countries, you have a situation of a much smaller number of groups, 43 groups in Kenya, and about 37, I believe, in Uganda. And here, the largest groups range from 16 to 20% of the population. And moreover, there are several other large players in each of these societies. In Rwanda, you have only two or three, if you want to get picky and refer to the Atwa, and in Nigeria, over 200 groups, and yet three large groups account for, what is it, Peter, just under 70% of the population, or is it about 2/3? So one is the configuration of ethnicity, and between those two poles, there's a continuum in between. There are a lot of middle cases, and if you look at the table that I present on page 154, you'll see that I have these 5 countries arrayed on the basis of the relative size of their groups, the percentage of the population taken up by the largest group, the top 3, 5, etc. Even that, however, does not explain conflict. To pick up on Jeff's point of ethnic grievance, one of the things that is typical about many African countries as a result of the legacy of the colonial period is a very high level of uneven economic development. Rich areas versus poor, because of the nature of the way the colonial economy evolved, particularly focusing on extractive industries, though not simply limited to that. And so, given the fact that different ethnic groups inhabit different spatial places, parts of a country, you have not only ethnicity, but you have ethnicity interacting with relative levels of development, and so you have, to put it crudely, rich tribes and poor, or those that are relatively rich and relatively poor with one another. And where you have a situation of particularly large groups that are favored, such as the Kikuyu in Kenya, roughly 20% of the population, and also by nature of their geography, just outside the capital city, and the area which historically became one of the most developed in Kenya because of coffee growing, ergo the development of schools, particularly at the secondary level. Come independence, and since then, who dominates the civil service? It's the Kikuyu. You see the same thing over in Uganda. Switching briefly to Nigeria, the largest groups in the north, but it was always a disadvantage from the standpoint of Western education. So the interactive effects between the configuration of ethnicity on the one hand and the configuration, particularly the spatial configuration of development on the other. And just parenthetically, space and spatial distributions of critical variables is one that political scientists tend to ignore, and I think policymakers too. We need to spend a lot more time on the spatial distribution of some of these critical factors, and some of my work on electoral systems has tried to speak to that. Finally, what do politicians do? It's not only leadership generally, and Mary talked about Mandela, and certainly in Tanzania we had Nyerere, who took a very natural situation, the large number of small groups. He could have ignored it. Instead, he purposely tried to capitalize on it. Swahili became the lingua franca across the country because rather than English, which was pushed in the schools, there were also natural endowments, not only a large number of small groups, but the fact that all but one or two of these groups speaks Bantu languages, which means they have the same grammar as Swahili, but he could have let it slide. So, from a standpoint of economic management, Nyerere was a failure, but in terms of capitalizing on these natural endowments and not mobilizing politics on the basis of ethnicity, Tanzania is arguably, there's a very deep sense of nationhood there, and it contributes to its stability. On the other hand, in Kenya and in Uganda, by comparison, mobilization, particularly for elections, for electoral support on the part of politicians, has been invariably ethnic bloc by ethnic bloc. Parties merge and disappear on ethnic lines, and then for presidential contests, they come together in loose coalitions. Those coalitions tend to break down. And if you look what is happening in Kenya already in the run-up to the election that will occur in about 10 months, this is actually exactly what is happening again. We know what happened in 2007, and it may well repeat itself. So finally, it's the intersection of these three variables, and again, to refer you to the table, I think that if you take a look at them together, then you can pretty well predict where the vulnerability to violence is greater. So how do you get out of this mess and where it exists and manage it? And as Jeff suggested, I suggest that federalism is not the silver bullet, but certainly a tool which, as we all know, has evolved over time specifically to address the perennial loser issue, whether it's a function of economic grievance or some other reason. If people are the perennial losers, they have cause to cause trouble. And federalism, however, has been resisted across Africa, and yet you now see a few cases, and I'm suggesting that perhaps federalism's time has come in Africa, Nigeria probably being the best example of how it's evolved, because it not only accorded the small groups voice, it broke up the large. And I'm frankly, of all the reforms that have taken place in Kenya, which give hope over the next 5 years, it's the devolution reform for the new constitution, because they have broken up the large groups as well as giving the small ones voice. Sadly, in Uganda, where you had a move towards federalism, you have an exercise by the president to claw back power and resources for the very reason that Jeff suggested. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Joel, very much. Well, that's a perfect segue to Peter in Nigeria. I said when I read your session, I thought, is this the example we're going to hold up for success in managing the fault lines? And those of us associated with Africa for a while, that makes you scratch your head a little bit. But over to you, Peter.
Well, you know, successes and challenges. I would like to echo my colleagues in saying this was a really remarkable project, and I would like to thank Greg and Jeff for convening and organizing this project. It took place in 3 continents over a period of 2 years, brought together a remarkable array of people, practitioners, academics from different disciplines, from different experiences, and we've met some really exceptional people, so it was a good set of discussions, and I think it's yielded an excellent volume, and thanks to Peter and to Ambassador Yates for convening and moderating this session. So Nigeria does encapsulate many of the issues and many of the challenges, as well as some of the successes that we find in divided societies. The broad landscape and the quick history can be sketched briefly. Nigeria is about 160 million people. It encompasses more than 250 distinct language groups and ethnic groups. And as Joel Barkan has pointed out, it also embodies very strong ethnic fractionalization or polarization, in that 3 groups, the northern House of Fulani, the southwestern Yoruba, and the southeastern Igbo, together comprise more than 2/3 of the population. However, none of them individually is more than 25% of the population. So there is not a majority group, it is a nation of minorities, but there are 3 minorities that clearly dominate the communal landscape. Overlaid, and not in any symmetric way, with the language and ethnic distinctions are religious distinctions. Demographically, the country is almost evenly divided among Christians and Muslims, perhaps a very slight Muslim majority. Muslims are the majority in the north, but it is not an entirely Muslim population. In the southwest, Muslims are a minority of probably about 35 to 40%, but quite substantial in the population. And of course, there are pockets of both faiths found all over the country. So you have a diverse religious demography as well as ethno-linguistic distinctions. And you have strong regional identities. Federalism has had an impact, as I'll mention toward the end of my brief remarks, but nonetheless, there are still very powerful and lingering distinctions, not only based on narratives in the post-independence period, but even more fundamentally on inequalities in access to education, in income, in resources, and in globalization, really, that really stem from earlier colonial structures and colonial experiences. So there's uneven development. There are a variety of different divisions or cleavages which may be activated or animated in different ways. And indeed, these have played out in unfortunate ways in many interludes and episodes of Nigeria's post-independence history. Violence erupted among ethnic and regional groups following the 1964 elections, the first post-independence elections. This led to military coups, that's plural, 2 coups in 1 year in 1966, pogroms against the Igbos in the north, the exodus of Igbos into the regional southeastern heartland in 1966 and the attempted secession of Biafra, leading to a cataclysmic civil war from 1967 to 1970, in which at least 1 million Nigerians perished and possibly twice that number. This was a catastrophic and profound experience for the entire nation. The federal system did hang together and did prevail, but it did lead to a great deal of experimentation and effort on the part of elites in the decades thereafter to try to maintain the integrity, the territorial integrity, and the idea of Nigeria. Obviously, civil wars, as we know from American experience, have a long-standing and lingering reach in the collective memory. So the last 4 decades have been episodic efforts at engineering various institutions and structures in order to really reach some modus vivendi, some basis of accommodation for the Nigerian polity and the Nigerian society. There was intermittent violence during the Second Democratic Interlude from 1979 to 1983, including what has become significant these days, and recalling back, a significant episode of Islamist millenarian insurgency. There was a long authoritarian interlude and then a transition to democratic rule in 1999. Since that time, since the transition to democracy in 1999, the inauguration of what is now called the Fourth Republic, Nigeria has had 4 elections and has been considered to be a country largely in a mode of relative peace, what we might say, under a democratic regime. However, it has been punctuated by more than 900 incidents of communal violence in which at least 15,000 people have died. And it has seen 2 major insurgencies. One, the southern, I would say largely resource-based insurgency in the Niger Delta, and currently the Salafist Boko Haram insurgency in the north, in which more than 1,200, perhaps as many as 1,500 people have perished just in the last 18 months. So while not in a state of open civil war, Nigeria is indeed a turbulent and violent and fraught polity. So we see cross currents. We see 2 different directions. One, the direction of division and of violence and of conflict. The other, an effort to manage these fault lines, an effort by Nigerian elites. And this brings me to my conclusions, which is that 2 elements stand out from this story in this chapter. And that is the balance between formal mechanisms of institutional engineering. Joel Barkan has referred to federalism, which is a good proxy for those efforts, and informal bargains among elites to avoid what Jeff Herbst has called a coalition of losers. That is to say, some kind of accommodation among elites from different ethno-regional groups and different segments. In the Nigerian case, based on a sharing of centralized oil rents, as a means of providing a kind of distributional politics that can give everybody a stake in the system. It's a kind of trading floor. It's a bargaining process. There are temporary winners and losers in this game, in this trading floor, but access to the trading process, to the bargaining process, is the sine qua non for keeping the system together and the system stable. And so I call this a balance between boundaries and bargains. On the one hand, Nigerian politicians and Nigerian elites have used federalism, revenue distribution, and other formal mechanisms as a way of sharing out oil rents and giving representation and some resources to various groups. On the other hand, elites bargain over resources. And just to conclude by referring to the current challenge from the Islamist insurgency, which I think stands as one of the most critical challenges to Nigeria's unity and Nigeria's stability that we've seen in decades. This is, I think, well encapsulated or well covered by the framework of this study as a revolt of a coalition of losers, that for various reasons, elements in the impoverished North who felt excluded from the political bargains of the most recent electoral cycle have taken advantage of a combination of poverty, social frustration, and Islamist ideology to escalate an insurgency across the North. And they are deliberately attempting to play on all of the various fissures, sometimes bringing in narratives of deprivation, very deliberately attacking Christians in an effort to provoke religious fissures, also attacking moderate Islamic clerics and government installations. So they're trying to push all the buttons in terms of aggravating fissures and trying to provoke instability. And this reflects, I would just say in conclusion, both the opportunities in terms of using mechanisms of federalism and mechanisms of redistribution and political bargains in trying to quell and stem and isolate this insurgency on the one hand, but also the very profound challenges in Nigeria's turbulent, divided society and the opportunities and risks of violence.
Thank you. Greg Mills, who is writing about his own country, South Africa, and I said that some of us who are quite old, were amazed when the fault line of the racial divide seemed to be managed, but now, as you write, we're at the tipping point between the haves and have-nots, and I think, where does that leave the rest of the continent if this divide is, sort of cataclysmic?
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you, Peter, and Mary for chairing this event and for hosting it, Peter. It's a valued association from the perspective of the Brenthurst Foundation that we enjoy with the Atlantic Council, and long may it continue. And thank you also to the authors, the co-originator of the project, Jeff, of course, and to Peter and Joel as well. As Jeff has mentioned, these are only a selection of the 24 case studies. And in fact, one of the aims of this project was to try and find out from those countries which had all the obvious fault lines why they hadn't in fact fallen apart. And maybe that's something for the future, as to a more in-depth study of India and Brazil, and in addition to countries like Indonesia, which are part of the study, as to how fault lines are better managed in some societies than others in a more explicit way. Jeff and I were recently in Gulu in northern Uganda. And when we were driving from the airport to the hotel, I think it could be called a hotel, I asked the driver where he was from, and he said, oh no, he was from the south of Kampala. And I said, oh, so you're not from here? No, he said. I said, so can you tell somebody who is from Gulu? And he said, yes, of course. He said, they're black. And I thought that said so much, particularly from the perspective of a white South African, always very hypersensitive to questions of race, that these divisions were far more than skin deep, although they were often given, in a sense, expression in terms of differences in skin tone even between racial groups. I'm not going to comment on Uganda, but I thought it was an interesting point to lead off into a discussion about a country, my own, South Africa, which has had the most obvious, perhaps, fault line of all in terms of its 350-year history of racial separation, segregation, and oppression. But the point I hope that my chapter makes, and as Mary has intimated, is that the fault lines in South Africa are changing very radically. Class, poverty, proximity to power, as well as regional divisions, the regions versus the center, are replacing race to a very great extent in terms of divisions within our society. Ethnicity less so, at least explicitly. There are notions of the Cosa Nostra, for example, and of this traditionalists versus the modernist divide within South African society, which is sort of shorthand for President Zuma versus the more modernizing interest in his cabinet, but it's much less of an explicit force within South Africa. Xenophobia, on the other hand, has been very pronounced, and that is why the chapter uses the title from District 6, of course the famous coloured township above the city of Cape Town, to District 9, which is the allegoric film which came out a couple of years ago, which is about South African xenophobia towards immigrants from the rest of Africa. And I go back in that regard to my comment about Gulu. Of course, today we have roughly 5 million whites living in South Africa, but there are roughly 5 million immigrants from the rest of Africa. So the divisions in some ways between white and black are matched in different ways, as people who spend time in South Africa, such as Ambassador Ramon, will know in a very xenophobic sense. What we have emerging within South African society, to put the District 9 to one side for a second, is in my mind a highly dichotomous society. One group on welfare, another in relative extreme wealth, exacerbated by a lack of focus and in fact at times incoherence on economic policy. We have a Gini coefficient which this year is measured at 57.8, which makes it one of the highest, if not the highest measured in the world, higher than most of Latin America. Sorry, Pablo. And perhaps most notably, you can see this in terms of the difference between taxpayers in South Africa, who number about 6 million people as registered taxpayers, and those living on welfare, who today number 16 million people. One of the highest per capita welfare states we have in the world, and we have a welfare state like that. Otherwise, these 16 million people would largely fall through the cracks of our society. But it's an indicator of a society which has a sort of stream which is progressing and a stream which is largely stalled, and I'll come back to that metaphor in a moment. In this, of course, the ANC, as Mary has reminded us, was elected 20 years ago by the majority of the very poorest of South Africans and the marginalized. And South Africa's progress, and let me not excuse this factor, has been very impressive by many indicators, particularly in social delivery, water, sanitation and the like in the rural areas, but it's been slower than the expectations of the majority of South Africans. It's against those expectations that this delivery is being measured. Corruption is worsening, not by my estimation, but in the estimation of the head of the South African Congress of Trade Unions, as well as Zima Vavi, and by a range of other independent indicators. Yet, interestingly, there's no revolt, or even suspicion of a revolt at the polls, and the politics of identity still pervade in South African society. They are still played to, even if they are not openly expressed. Redistribution, there's also in this been a continuing centralizing tendency, which has been exacerbated by an erosion of capacity, at least lacking the capacity which is required to get the job done. Yet, paradoxically, government is infused by a sense of self-belief and self-purpose. In other words, that we'll do it better than anybody has been able to do it before. And it's a sort of reinventing very much an old, worn-down socialist mantra in the process. In this redistribution has become a key mechanism for government delivery, but as Jeffrey reminded us in his, I think, seminal article in Foreign Affairs about 5 years ago, this is very much a once-off process. In this, as a result of this, state has become the employer of choice. Just to give you some statistics, there are 17.7 million workers in South Africa. Of these, 9.2 million are employed or involved in the formal sector, and that is according to government statistics. South Africa's real unemployment position is 6.75 million people, or 38% of the labour force, although this is under 25% if one uses the government's methodology. This is still, regardless, several times higher than the average for the 56 countries constantly monitored by The Economist, which is about 8.6%. I'm afraid Spain doesn't fall into that category right at the moment, but certainly South Africa's is. I think Spain has just exceeded South Africa's official limit, official unemployment rate for the first time. But more importantly, the number of jobs in South Africa is still several hundred thousand below the peak reached before the 2008 global recession. And most of the new jobs created since that time are temporary rather than full-time. and we have about 900,000 new job seekers entering the labour market every single year. So what's essentially happened in South Africa is that formal sector employment has increased radically, about 10% over the last 2 years in government employment, but has shrunk correspondingly in the private sector. And I think in this it's important to point out two notable income trends which have emerged. Average inflation incomes have risen very sharply across the board, about nearly 4% a year since 2000. And income inequality between white and black South Africans has declined very sharply. In 2000, for example, the average black South African earned 1.5% of the average white South African's income, which is an unbelievably shocking statistic. Currently, 1.3 million black South Africans, which is 14% of the workforce, earn more than their average white counterparts. To a great extent, these improvements in income have been to do with an increase in employment in the civil service. Over the past decade, government employment has increased from 1 million people to nearly 1.3 million people, and the proportion of black South Africans as part of the civil service from 40 to roughly 75%. So 40% of South Africa's highest earning black members of our society are currently employees of the South African government. So there's been a tremendous shift in income terms, but also in employment within the civil service. But this, I think, obscures some of the very big challenges within the private sector. The government has attempted to deal with this by expanded public works programs. We've allocated $10 million to try and create 1.5 million jobs by 2014, with an aim to create 5 million new jobs by 2020. But this has proven very difficult to achieve, and has fallen. Our achievements have fallen well below this. The government in all of this has recognized the importance of unlocking the potential in the private sector, but it remains paradoxically ideologically pinned to policies which do not supply the necessary confidence to do this. And there's a great ambivalence to private capital, despite the rhetoric to the contrary, and in fact the government is now attempting to create new state-owned enterprises or resuscitate old ones as a way of remedying the job shortage in the market. This is exacerbated by increasing dependence on mineral exports, which remain more than 55% of merchandise exports in South Africa, very low productivity, which relates, of course, to very low rates of skills, and the real difficulty we've had in South Africa of improving rates of skills. We spend nearly 20% of government budget on education, which is a very, very high figure by anybody's standards, yet 50% of students who enroll at grade 1 fail to reach grade 12. So 20 years on, we still continue to face these challenges in our society. Private sector wages are rising much faster than public sector wages are rising much faster than private sector wages, and government expenditure at about 30% of GDP in terms of the budget and borrowings has of course the impact of crowding out to a large extent the private sector. Private sector growth and diversification as a result has proven very difficult in this environment, hence the foundation of this the new dichotomous society in the country. And understandably in all of this, government continues, albeit not explicitly, to continue to play the politics of identity. And opposition politics, with some changes around the edges, largely still play into these differences. I was privy to a meeting recently between the leader of the opposition and another opposition party, where it was discussed about how to break the mold of South African politics. It's in the formal opposition's best interest to do so. It's not in the interest of other opposition parties, because that's where their support base exists, and that's what they will say very explicitly. And all of this, I think, is exacerbated by an intense introspection caused by perpetual ruling party succession issues and ongoing crises, as you've seen recently with the Julius Malema issue. And of course, there is no clear international relations strategy, particularly with regard to Africa in the Zuma era. And for this reason, I think that many people now in South Africa describe at least this era as one of being not a failed state at all, by no manner of means, but a stalled state, one where the politics of identity still pervade, as I've said, and where government is unable to make progress beyond the rhetorical on a whole range of government programs, from national growth paths to national development plans and so on. So, as Mary has said at the introduction, South Africa's obvious dividing lines between white and black clearly have mutated into other things, and there's clear divide today between the haves and the have-nots. And the real debate as to how we remedy this, although politics paradoxically remains in the interests of political players to continue to play to these old dividing lines, or even one generation on from our transition. Let me say 4 quick things in conclusion to circle back on what Jeffrey has said at the outset of today's presentation. I think the prominence or not of fault lines in Africa has gone hand in hand with both the legitimacy and the performance of the post-colonial state. It's been clearly worsened by bad leadership and has coalesced in this case around such divisions. Contrastingly, these divisions have been alleviated by better governance, including democratization, and by, very importantly, the point that he made, by improved economic performance. Economic grievance has been a clear spark for inflammation, sometimes deliberately caused as a divide and rule strategy in order to remain in power. The second point I would make is that the message is clear. Divisions, however, around religious, ethnic and other fault lines does not have to end in violence. This is not in any way preordained, and management is absolutely imperative and includes building long-term systems and institutions of democratization. The third point is that the response has a number of potential tools, both international and local. The obvious and most radical one, of course, is around the reconfiguration of borders. I'm not sure yet what South Sudan says about the reconfiguration of borders in Africa. It's probably not terribly encouraging, as Mary has indicated and as Anna Rader's excellent chapter does as well, because it's, I think, or shown us there's a whole range of other divisions which exist just below the surface as well. The second aspect, or second tool, is one of federalism, both rhetorical federalism and actual federalism. And I think the Ethiopian chapter points out is how the government of Ethiopia has used very effectively the promise of federalism as a way of diffusing potential tensions. I don't believe it has any interest, or there's no reality in the suggestion that states might secede in Ethiopia, but certainly the promise remains out there and has a way of taking some of the temperature out of the debate. There's a necessary third to shake some of the traditional templates of international engagement, focusing on local level engagement and economic reconstruction. And what we know from the experience of others, for example, should inform, I think, the building, for example, of decentralized policing structures. And I think when we look at Somalia, Peter, your neck of the woods, when we think about what sort of policing structures are going to be created in Somalia, we should think about maybe replicating some aspects of the American model in terms of the role of decentralization there. And then I think, in terms finally of early warning, it's very important to recalibrate what we see as failure. It does not have to be an explosion of violence and of humanitarian disaster to be failure, which leads to ruptures around such fault lines. And I think that leads lastly to the key question for me, which is, can we determine when a state is likely to fail? Is it when it stops providing for the majority of its citizens? And when do local grievances escalate to the national level? And when do they escalate from being peaceful opposition, which in the case of South Africa they have largely hitherto been, into violence? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. And we are going to turn to Somalia immediately, but thank you for reminding us on the nation building how young South Africa is, and your reference to France taking such a long time, and we know our War of Independence 85 years after our Declaration of Independence. So I think it's important to keep that date in mind. Excellent. Now Somalia.
Thank you very much, Mary. And I'll be relatively brief, since I think we really want to turn this over to a discussion. In many respects, a chapter on Somalia in a volume that's subtitled Managing Tensions and Divisions Within Society seems almost oxymoronic. It's almost Somalia, when I subtitle it, What Not to Do. And certainly there's a lot to be said about that. The world's most spectacularly failed state, 21 years since the collapse of the last entity that could reasonably be called a government of Somalia. And now we're on the 14th or 15th transitional iteration, depending on how you count them, and it's got a life span legally of only 2 more months before it must give way to get another transitional structure of some sort. Although we're running out of acronyms, we've had a transitional national government, we're now on a transitional federal government, so we have to come up with a new acronym by August 20th. However, despite all that, I'd make 2 major points. One is, it's not as failed as one would see looking from the outside. And in fact, it's just not what we expect in the international community. The Westphalian system, which despite everything has lasted all these centuries, but there is a organizational reality in there. And interestingly enough, delighted we're honored by the presence of the ambassador of Spain to the United States, who was with me and several others in the room in Somaliland just 2 years ago in the north, when we watched an entity unrecognized by the international community that's managed to pull it together for 20 years. They maintain the peace. It's the only case in all of Africa where a national liberation movement, the Somali national movement in Somaliland, put itself out of business once it had liberated the territory and proclaimed its independence, not recognized. It literally went into cantonment, turned in its weapons, and didn't even become a political party. In fact, allowed 3 and now 4 political parties to emerge out of it. So there are, and that's probably the most advanced case, but throughout Somalia, you see entities on a regional basis emerging with various levels of capacity and legitimacy, but governance emerging, compared with the internationally recognized transitional federal government, which the European-sponsored audit of its books turned out that the last 2 years stole 96% of bilateral aid. I guess if we give them an extension in August, they might improve upon that efficiency and capture the remaining 40% that needs to be captured. So there is within Somalia, despite that, because within the society there are natural organic elements, the clan structure, the alliances that people form, that have permitted large swaths of the country to become relatively stable and well organized. The other point I would make very briefly is that within Somalia, we also see the case of the limits of the international community's ability to dictate from the outside. We may have international norms, we may have a desire that there be a government that we can connect with on a diplomatic level, but in reality, we cannot impose that. 14 failed transitional entities hatched at various international conferences held with at great cost and both political and financial resources reveal that we can't impose a regime from the outside. All we end up often creating is perverse incentives for rent-seeking behavior. And so ultimately, whatever emerges has to emerge from the bottom up. And we have to look for mechanisms to recognize these nascent structures and where they serve regional and international interests in stability, protection of civilians and others, we engage with them. And so the limits, a certain humility in international order, I think, is called for. So with that, with those remarks, given the time pressing upon us, I'll conclude and hand it back to Mary.
Well, I think, Peter, you're going to think I failed as moderator since we have 15 minutes left for the 45-minute discussion. So I probably won't be invited back. And I'm going to turn it to the audience. I've had the advantage of reading the book, which since you've just gotten it, I'm going to tee up a couple of questions, but I want then to turn it to the audience and let you either pick up on them or have at these brilliant authors up here. And the management of the fault lines and this idea of, the role of prevention. I mean, I think it's a fascinating idea. How do you do it? If you've got the group of the dispossessed, the group of the economically aggrieved, how do we as the international community work with this group? Second thought, I found the book a little bit tough on the international community. I think most of us are part of that. Peter's tough on it, the introduction is tough on it. What is the role of the international community? Especially critical of the elections and pushing for elections over governance. But if the international community collectively didn't move towards elections, would they ever have happened? Would the referendum have happened in South Sudan, et cetera, et cetera? So I'd like to have a little more discussion on that. The idea and focus on governance and leadership. I think that it isn't just an accident that leaders and statesmen come out of countries. Where would we be right now in South Sudan if we still had John Garang? But what can we do to help identify? I was there for the President's Africa Youth Forum and the First Lady's follow-up in South Africa. The leaders are abundant on the continent. These brilliant young people who know how to communicate with each other are there, but they're just appalled at their governments and their politics. So how do we reach them and encourage them to take on the leadership of their countries? And I don't know, the thorny issue of boundaries that you conclude with. I mean, have we really opened Pandora's box in South Sudan? Is this a way to solve some of these? So I had individual questions for people, but over to the audience and please ask your questions. Yes, and please identify yourself.
Dave Cabrera with Brookings Initiative on International Service. My question is one that Ray Chambers, the UN envoy on malaria and health MDGs, recently discussed with General Jones, President Obama's former NSC director. And General Jones said to Ray that the work you're doing on health MDGs and engagement is far more effective, if I could beg a wrong paraphrase, but than a lot of our hard power assets that we might apply to these conflicts. So I want to tee up, because Ray has asked us to do a study on this issue of the soft power effects of interventions like health. And just 3 examples in your neck of the woods. In Kenya, there is the UN in July 2nd in East Africa, Youth-Oriented Peace Service Corps being formed in places like the Rift Valley in Malo, which was the epicenter of the violence, engaging youth, Kikuyu and Kalenjins, doing remarkable things that have moved the needle on identity conflicts. In Nigeria, the North-South, the Sultan in the North, there's a BedNet campaign with 70 million Muslims represented in the archbishops that have brought Christians and Muslims together. So whether youth engagement or interfaith engagement in things like malaria, I know polio was licked in India with quite a success story in Hindu-Muslim. And in South Africa, DPRU at Cape Town, where I'll be on a fellowship this fall in Cape, is looking at youth livelihoods and scale up in economic areas. So I posit maybe a partial ray of hope or answer, but is that a valid question, that soft power interventions like these, whether youth or malaria, could ameliorate or address this fault line?
Okay. And I'm going to take a couple of questions and then ask the panel to reflect on these. So the first one is soft power's interface with the fault lines. And, yes, sir.
Questions to Greg.
Please identify yourself.
Oh, Pablo Rodas from Guatemala. You were visiting about a year ago Central America. In Central America, we had these 3 cases of civil war: Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. Do you have any lessons after your visit to Central America? Do you have any lessons from Central America that could be applied to Africa?
Okay. And one more. Yes, Ambassador from.
Thank you. I'm Ramon Gil Casares, the ambassador of Spain. Now, I'm a bit surprised that you've not pronounced the term African Union, or you've not referred to any of the regional economic communities. Do you think they have a role to play in managing these grievances, or they just, you think that because of the history they've not even worth mentioning?
Sure. Thank you. Let's get some panel reaction to those first 3 questions. We'd like to address the idea of the soft power and that needs to be part of the prevention.
I'll start on soft power and youth in particular. I've looked at this issue at some length in the Middle East. where there have been countless exercises to get Israeli and Palestinian youth and young leaders together. I think it's a waste of time, frankly. Not that getting people together and having them play soccer teams, mixed or individual, isn't fun, but the notion that the problem is that people don't understand each other, that's wrong. They understand each other all too well, and they have plenty of interaction with each other. They have problems with each other that are not about misunderstanding, but are at the end of the day, as I stress, about very hard economic and other issues of distribution. So I think we're kidding ourselves that if we believe we get a bunch of young people together, it'll somehow solve a profound problem. If you want to address malaria, address malaria, which I think is in and of itself, frankly, enough of an issue. I don't see why you think or why we should think that that's going to address fault line issues unless the issue has been the maldistribution of health resources. I think we often load onto these programs too much in the way of expectations. Malaria kills a lot of people. If we can reduce that, I think that's wonderful. I don't think, however, unless that goes to the actual dynamics of a division, that we should expect any decrease in violence.
Then on soft power, yeah, Joel.
Well, there's soft power and soft power. I would agree with all that Jeff said in terms of looking at the health program as a panacea. On the other hand, one dimension of soft power is the support that we've provided to civil society in some of these countries over the last 20 years. That's been a sustained effort. In some respects, in some places, Kenya is certainly one example, since that's the country you mentioned, where it's given rise to a group of new leaders who are also, I might say, more globally oriented. They're internet savvy. They appreciate international norms. And on this issue of federalism that I was mentioning before, or more generally dealing with inequality, it's among this strata that you're more likely to hear voices from dominant groups and from the privileged who basically say, look, it's in our long-term interest, let alone the morality of this, to make some accommodations here. And I think that's when you begin to get movement within the political system, whether it's federalism or some other means, to cut across the economic divides, particularly when they're interfaced with the ethnic divide.
Greg, can you respond to our Guatemalan?
Yeah, I'll respond to a couple of things if I may. And I think on the question of the international community, I think there's a fundamental kind of premise here, which is do no harm before you try and do any good. And I think the same premise also applies to the African Union. Of course, the African Union, what is the African Union, Ramon? I mean, is it the 54 countries that are members of the AU, or is it the Commission? If it's the Commission, well, then you see a degree of increasing effectiveness, I think, at least currently, wherever this new election leads us, we'll have to wait and see. But the trajectory is of improvement. The trajectory is of greater authority and power, but continuously rather like the UN, running up against the interests of member states. And you know, if you take the AU, or if you devolve it down to a level to the regional economic communities, I think the same problems exist, and you see this in the management of conflicts, whether they be Zimbabwe or elsewhere. Is that there's a set of vested interests which have to take into consideration broader interests, which sometimes I think work against the immediate resolution. So I'm a fan of the African Union, and I do think that there have been big strides made recently, but I do think that we have to realize that, like the UN, there are severe built-in limitations. I think we also need to understand better on the issue of post-conflict recovery, how to spend money in these environments. My experience is not just in Africa, I've spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, and I can tell you that in environments where the only metrics exist around the expenditure of aid rather than about the effect, I think we're in deep trouble. And I think that we don't fully understand the short-term stability requirements often overtake the longer-term needs in terms of development, and this leads to tremendous tensions and problems over the longer term, which we don't fully understand. So I think I think we should always try and keep an eye, and maybe this is my business sector orientation, is we should try and keep an eye on the 9th MDG, the one that doesn't exist, which is about the costs of doing business in these environments. And aligning expenditure on the costs of doing business would, I think, be immensely helpful in providing the sort of enabling environment that's going to ultimately allow these countries to recover from the bottom up. Let me make a comment, Pablo, about your lessons from Central America. Well, it's very opportune that you mentioned this because, of course, at one book launch, Professor Herbst and I are busy trying to finish the proofs of another book, which is due out in August this year, which is called Africa's Third Liberation. That's not a very cheap way of advertising a forthcoming book, albeit it is a cheap way of advertising a book. It includes a very detailed section on lessons from Central America. I think the lessons are not always good. In fact, in many cases, including our own country, they're pretty bad. In Honduras, they're probably even worse. They're sometimes good, about the importance of stability and of economic recovery, and El Salvador is illustrative of how to get that dimension right. I think what they illustrate is that they require constant attention. These processes of recovery and of reform, they're not one-off events. There's a lot of hard work, there's a lot of political fixes that have to happen as part of this process, and I think overwhelmingly, and this relates much more to the question of the fault lines, is that one of the things that we have identified as part of the study is that what Africa largely lacks, particularly by comparison to Southeast Asia, but also by comparison to much of Central America, is an overwhelming focus on development as the defining issue. That governments are, that citizens hold governments accountable for economic choices. And what we don't have in Africa is that mood, is that political consciousness. What we have is governments are elected based on questions of identity, and they play to those questions of identity as a strategy to be elected. We don't have, as a result of this, the sort of laser focus as we expect, as we have come to expect from East Asia, and in the case of some countries, Costa Rica, for example, we see in Central America, and I think that exacerbates these patterns of division within societies. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you.
One word about the AU. I mean, where's the AU meeting going to be held? In Addis. Why? Because the Malawians threatened to arrest al-Bashir if it was held as scheduled there. I think that says a lot about the AU's potential to address internal divisions and which side it's on.
It also says a lot about the Malawians, and not positive.
Peter says I can take one more round of questions, so can we? Yes. Please identify yourself.
I'm Carl Levan from American University. And at the start of the presentations, Professor Herbst, and I've enjoyed your books very much, gave sort of an overview picture and talked a little bit about the long arc of war over the last century and conflict and that sort of thing. And I was wondering if you could elaborate either in the big picture frames or from some of the case studies about the relationship between this shift towards domestic violence or violence at the domestic level and the relationship with democracy. Because there's a really understudied contradiction where, as Professor Mills just pointed out, people have been able to hold their governments accountable in many places for bad economic decisions. I'm thinking particularly of Africa, but people have done a pretty lousy job holding their governments accountable for deciding to solve conflicts through violence. There are plenty of cases of this. So why haven't the political costs of decisions to use violence gone up with democracy?
Thank you. Very good question. Anyone else? Yes.
Hi, E.J. Hogan with the International Crisis Group. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit on the whole issue of the resource curse and how that impacts these fault lines, particularly as, Nigeria is an interesting example where perhaps it's been used in both ways to some degree to kind of cement communities or at least to pay off communities and to keep them from revolting, but also exacerbating these inequalities and what that can mean for the future of Africa as we're seeing a new scramble in both East and West Africa, where there's a lot of oil coming on board, and a lot of these extractive industries are going to be playing a much greater role in terms of how governance is implemented in these countries.
Okay, then we'll have to talk about our own resource curse as well, not the indigenous one. Yes.
My name is Ulubanke King Akerele. I'm from Liberia, former Foreign Minister of Liberia, former Minister of Commerce and Industry. I've had to deal with a lot of some of the things you're talking about, and if you will excuse me, I have a couple of pointers I need to make as I listen to what you've said. First of all, congratulations. I like it. I like the concept and the approach and the idea of the fault lines and trying, therefore, how to manage those fault lines. It's extremely critical in my part of West Africa, the Mana River Union, which, in fact, we have been involved in very much. On the issue of the role of the international community, I would suggest very strongly that you all take a look at the concept and the application of the International Contact Group and the kinds of roles they have played in the different countries. I represented Liberia, the head of the Mana River Union countries, on the International Contact Group on Guinea, ICGG. And I can tell you that over about 2 years, the International Contact Group had played a critical role in trying to assist the management of that situation in Guinea, the lead up to the elections, the actual elections and all of that. Having said that, you then have the spillover effects in terms of these various crises. The regional imperatives, I've heard nothing about the sub-regional economic relationships. I've heard about federalism as the answer to part of the problem, but I was surprised not to hear about the economic dimension. You have the example from Southeast Asia, the IMS, the growth triangles, the ASEAN and all of that. I spent about 4-6 months in Southeast Asia. My background, by the way, is 24 years with the international system with UNDP. So I want to put that on the table. I was surprised. I've heard nothing about regional integration. And it is an approach that is critical, micro-regionalism as well as regional integration. Second, the issue of federalism. I think federalism may be valid as a function of the size of the country. Nigeria is a unique case. The size of the country, the coming on stream of independence of Nigeria had to be federal. And the cost dimension of going federalism as the answer. I think what you want to think about is more decentralization and the role of devolution of authority from the central, but it doesn't mean that it's federalism. Take my country. We recently are going for a decentralization of authority, but we had a major discussion in cabinet that we must be careful. You can't go for federalism in a country where the population is 3.5 million. Where there's not the economic and financial wherewithal. Okay, Nigeria, the concept of coalition of losers. I think what you have in Nigeria is a more critical change in terms of the North coming to grips with the reality that it is no longer going to be the overarching entity there. So I don't know if the formulation of coalition of losers is right, but the economic deprivation is critical.
Thank you very much.
So I just want to point these in. I look forward to an opportunity to talk with some of you all. Thank you very much.
I think, Jeff, you've got the first question.
Sure.
On the democratization.
I'm not sure actually how well citizens have held African governments to account economically, but there's a difference, and I try to keep the vocabulary straight, between countries that have adopted the form of democracy, most notably multi-party elections, and democracies, which are often defined as having, within a specific period of time, a rotation of leaders who are voted out of power. That's happened much less often, and much less often, frankly, since the mid-1990s, when a lot of the old regimes collapsed, and there was an infusion of new democratic talent. But in this very twilight period, where there are elections, but people don't necessarily believe they're fair, or that the authoritarians will leave, or that the international community will endorse the leaders leaving if there's violence, and this is one of the residuals of the Kenya and Zimbabwe solution, where the losers got to win, and where the forms of democracy, whether they be courts, the press, or otherwise, are underdeveloped. In these moments where countries are in between, in Freedom House rankings, most countries in Africa are partly free. They're neither not free or free. You often have fault line struggles by other means. Pauline Baker said that many of the initial democratic takeovers after the Cold War ended and the large number of the old authoritarian regimes in Africa failed were civilian coups. That is, another group moving into power simply because the political game had changed and they had an in. Not that they were true Democrats. Now, maybe they were also true Democrats. But I think what we're seeing in this very mixed moment, which is inevitable because the transition to democracy, if it's going to happen, will be long and difficult, is that people play the game partially for democracy, but they also play the game for their advantage. And sometimes, on occasion, violence breaks out, either because there are certain people who see it to their advantage, or because the situation spins out of control.
Thank you very much. Peter, would you like to answer the ICG's question on the resource curse, since we've spoken about Nigeria?
Sure, there were a couple of things that touch on this case. So, the resource curse, as you implied by your question, carries different implications. On the one hand, it can provide central governments with the resources to both buy off and repress opponents, thereby stabilizing the system. Whether it's a malign or beneficial system is another question, but stabilizing the system and maintaining some integrity and some rough stability. On the other hand, struggles over rent distribution are an inherently destabilizing element. This comes as an intra-elite process where different segments of the elite want to capture control of the state. It can lead to violence in democratic systems and violence around elections, or it can lead to coups and other kinds of extra-constitutional maneuvers. It can also carry consequences, as is, I think, probably an increasingly large risk for some of the new producers, when regional groups whose communities are impacted by oil production or other resource production feel relatively deprived and marginalized in the political system, and may be the source of insurgencies. We've seen this in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta. We saw UNITA successes in the diamond producing regions, other resource wars in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and so forth, in Congo. So the prevalence of resource wars is in fact sort of the latest iteration in the literature on the resource curse, and it carries both elements. It comes back to governance. This governance theme is not just a trope. If we turn back to the initial round of questions about health, managing health and public goods broadly gives people a sense of inclusion and can serve as something of a salve to some fault lines. There's good evidence from Northern Ireland that even British rule, in terms of trying to equalize outcomes in public services, laid some groundwork for negotiations over resolving that conflict. Certainly in the oil-producing states or the resource-producing states of the world, management of revenues in a transparent way, domestic equity is a critical element. So those are the aspects of the resource curse that I think are relevant. The other question about federalism and size is, I think, very apposite. It's quite right. Not only the design of not only whether to use federalism or decentralization, but also the design of federalism is important. I think in Nigeria, federalism has been a relatively successful experiment. There's been a willingness to revisit and modify both revenue allocation, state divisions, and so forth. In Ethiopia, by contrast, I think the adoption of a rather rigid, sort of Stalinist model of federalism has aggravated divisions, even while carrying some potentially beneficial effects in terms of managing a large state. But certainly large states with high degrees of ethnic fractionalization strongly recommend the adoption of federalism. Smaller states where, to borrow a phrase from Jeff, the broadcast of power may be a little bit more feasible in terms of the capital and the hinterland, may speak for decentralization.
And Madam Minister, you raised a host of questions, and I think some of them are actually grist for even yet another book. I think some of the issues are dealt with in this book, but we haven't discussed it in the panel, the economic. But about the international community and the contact group, I think Dr. Pham would like to make a comment as well.
Thank you. And thank you for raising the points. I think you're absolutely right about these fault lines also run over borders, as we know, the Mano River countries and the conflict that began in Liberia, spreading to Sierra Leone, and providing me fodder for 2 books early in my career. So certainly those are, and I think that's a dimension we could probably take greater stock in. As for contact groups, I would say just generically, we shouldn't look in the international community for magic bullets. Everything is very specific. And contact groups can go one of 2 ways. They can be, if they're very carefully defined, they can achieve limited goals. In the Guinea case you cite, yes, they got elections through, but then, since then, it's nearly 2 years, he's not held legislative elections, and he's not going to, I predict, because he's going to lose them. So we'd much rather have an appointed consultative council than ever have a democratic transition, and there the contact group has sort of dropped the ball. On the other hand, contact groups can also metastasize. The Somali contact groups have become cancerous. What started as 1 became 2. What became 2, the piracy group, the separated piracy group, has now metastasized into 4 or 5. And it's become cancerous. They all have lots of meetings several times a year, but Somalia is just as broken today as it was in 1991, if not more so. So we can't fetishize, but I think it's a useful tool among others in a context.
But Johnny Carson got to Mogadishu last Sunday.
Mary, can I just add one quick thing?
Absolutely.
Just two quick points on the
Greg,
resource
enjoy.
curse. I think there's been a very big change in the nature of the resource curse. And broadly speaking, it's gone from the use of resources to fund rebel movements to now a question of who gains nationally from the resources within African borders. So, they've gone from being a curse, of course, in the 80s and 90s to largely being seen as a huge asset with natural resource prices, and that, of course, has been one of the principal reasons why African growth rates have increased. But it's much less about the funding of guerrilla movements or rebel movements today than about the division of spoils and who's making which money out of them and the governance associated with it. And there, of course, is a critical issue about the role of China and the impact on governance and so on and so forth. And I think all the evidence, I would say, is that China wants to play the role around governance that has been played by other international actors. And sometimes the hyperbole doesn't illustrate that, because they know that in the long term it's going to protect their interests as well as the governance protects the interests of others in the same way. Of course, they will try and take shortcuts, because Chinese companies are not one thing. They're big companies, they're very small companies, and all stops in between. But it is a very varied and nuanced picture in terms of the management of resources and governance with them. And on regional integration, I would just make one point, and that is, African governments have been much better at regional integration when it comes to conflict resolution, peacekeeping forces, and the like. But they have been extraordinarily poor when it comes to lowering the costs of trade logistics. I mean, there's a rhetoric on regional integration which would make you think that the continent is one, and we're all working in the sort of same, towards the same goal and in the same direction. The reality is that African countries very jealously guard their borders when it comes to trade, because it is a point of revenue, it's a point of arbitrage. And so the rhetoric, the African rhetoric of regional integration and the reality of doing business across borders, I think, doesn't often meet the eye.
Joel, you get the final word, and then I'll say goodbye.
Yeah, visit any border posts and see the trucks lined up a couple of miles back. On the issue of federalism, we shouldn't get hung up on that either. It's really an issue of a concentration of power. Federalism is simply one mechanism among a number to ensure that you don't have perennial losers, and it has to be backed up with proper fiscal support. particularly in rural areas where the tax base is very low. That is to say, are you going to reallocate at the center and guarantee subnational units some significant slice of the pie, which the Kenyans, by the way, have done with their new constitution. Written into that constitution is that 15% of the what's collected by the Kenya Revenue Authority is going to go to these new entities. It's similar to the formula for distributing the oil rents in Nigeria. But more broadly, legislative executive relations. I mean, Africa historically has been this concentration of the power in the imperial presidency perpetuated by elections. So when Jeff points to the fact that all, I think, but 3 African countries have had elections, and yet if you look at the Freedom House rankings, they run the gamut from the highest to the very low. You really want to bust up those imperial presidencies, and here again, ultimately, there has to be a constitutional basis for it, but that has to be negotiated, and that's where I'm not so sure whether the international community can be effective here. It's really bringing the elites together to realize that the long-term stability and their interests require it, but it's going to vary greatly, obviously, from one country to the next.
Thank you very much. Thank all of you. I'd like to thank the panel and the audience. I think the reason you're still here is because of the academic star wattage on the stage that you had a chance to listen to. But I thank you for your patience. I think the book is a brilliant idea. The case studies are absolutely informative. But as the questions indicate, we can take it a next step. How about the interrelationship, with these fault lines within one society? What happens? What happens when Move 70 passes on and those fault lines then start bleeding into other places, et cetera, et cetera? So, I think there's a chance for another book.
There we go.
Thank you all.
Thank you.